There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't come from the dark or from the unknown, but from a knock at the door you weren't expecting, from a voice on the phone that knows things it shouldn't, and from a stranger standing in your driveway who seems to have arrived from nowhere and who looks at you like he already knows how this conversation is going to end. Tonight, we're going to talk about them. The Men in Black, not the movie, not the comic book, the real ones. For almost 80 years, ordinary people, pilots, doctors, military officers, and journalists have reported encounters with mysterious figures who arrive uninvited after UFO sightings, who speak in flat, monotone voices, who wear suits that look brand new but decades out of style, and who deliver a single, chilling message. Stop talking, stop looking, forget what you saw. Some of these visitors have been described as not quite human, with skin like plastic, lips painted an unnatural red, and movements so rigid and mechanical that witnesses have compared them to mannequins brought to life. Others seemed human enough on the surface, but possessed knowledge that no ordinary person should have had. Details about private moments, about objects locked in desk drawers, about conversations that took place behind closed doors. They arrive in black cars that vanish around corners that don't exist. They make threats, they confiscate evidence, and then they disappear, often leaving behind nothing but a lingering sense of dread and the faint smell of something chemical that no one can quite place. The stories we're going to explore tonight stretch across decades and across continents, from the rain-soaked harbors of the Pacific Northwest in 1947 to a quiet hotel lobby in Niagara Falls in 2008. Each one was told by a different person, in a different place, under different circumstances. And yet, when you lay them side by side, the similarities are impossible to ignore. Something connects these encounters. Whether that something is a government operation, an alien intelligence, or something else entirely, is a question that has haunted researchers for generations. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin where the story of the Men in Black truly starts, on a gray afternoon in the waters off the coast of Washington State, when a man named Harold Dahl saw something in the sky that would change his life forever. It was June 21st, 1947, and Harold Dahl was doing what he did most days, patrolling the waters near Maury Island in Puget Sound, Washington, aboard his small harbor patrol boat. The afternoon sky was overcast, a flat sheet of pale gray that pressed down on the water like a lid, and Dahl was working his usual route with two crewmen, his 15-year-old son Charles, and the family dog. There was nothing remarkable about the day. The engine hummed, the water lapped against the hull, and then Dahl looked up. Hovering in the sky above him, silent and enormous, were 6 objects. They were shaped like donuts, like massive rings with holes in their centers, and they hung in the air as though suspended by invisible strings. Dahl estimated each one was roughly 100 feet across. 5 of them hovered in a loose circle around a 6th, which appeared to be in some kind of distress, wobbling and dropping altitude in a way that suggested it was struggling to stay airborne. As Dahl and his crew watched, frozen in disbelief, the central craft began shedding material, dropping what looked like sheets of hot, dark metal into the water below. Some of the debris rained down onto the boat itself. One piece struck and killed Dahl's dog. Another piece burned his son's arm badly enough to require medical attention. Dahl managed to snap a few photographs before the objects ascended and disappeared into the overcast sky. When the family got back to shore, Dahl was shaken, but determined to report what he'd seen. And this is where the story takes its first dark turn. The very next morning, before Dahl had told almost anyone about the encounter, before any newspaper had run a word about it, there was a knock at his door. Standing on his porch was a man Dahl had never seen before. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark suit, and he drove a black sedan, which was unusual enough in itself given the modest neighborhood Dahl lived in. The man didn't introduce himself as a government agent. He didn't flash a badge. He simply invited Dahl to breakfast at a nearby diner, and Dahl, still rattled from the previous day, agreed. What happened at that diner would echo through the decades. Sitting across from Dahl in a quiet booth, the stranger began recounting the events of the previous afternoon in extraordinary detail. The number of objects Dahl had seen, the way the debris fell, the injury to his son, the death of the dog. He described things he could not possibly have known unless he had been there, watching from somewhere unseen. And then, in a voice that Dahl later described as calm but heavy with implied menace, the man leaned forward and told him that if he valued the safety of his family, he would never speak of what he had witnessed again. Then the man stood up, left the diner, and was gone. Dahl was terrified. In the days that followed, he confided in his supervisor, a man named Fred Chrisman, who took an interest in the debris Dahl had collected from the boat. Word eventually reached Raymond Palmer, the editor of a science fiction magazine called Amazing Stories, who in turn contacted a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold. Arnold had made national headlines just 3 days after Dahl's sighting by reporting 9 shining objects moving at incredible speed near Mount Rainier, an incident that essentially launched the modern UFO era and gave the world the term flying saucers. Palmer hired Arnold to fly to Tacoma and investigate Dahl's claims. Arnold, out of his depth, then contacted 2 Air Force intelligence officers, Captain William Davidson and Lieutenant Frank Brown, who flew up from Hamilton Field in California to conduct their own investigation. Davidson and Brown interviewed Dahl and Chrisman, collected samples of the debris, and prepared to fly back to California the following morning. Both men were experienced intelligence officers, the kind of careful, methodical professionals who didn't spook easily, and they had spent hours going over the evidence with the meticulous attention to detail that their training demanded. But they never made it home. On August 1st, 1947, their B-25 bomber crashed outside Kelso, Washington, killing both men. The cause was officially listed as engine failure, but rumors immediately swirled that the plane had been sabotaged to prevent the evidence from being analyzed. The debris they had been carrying was never recovered from the wreckage. In the aftermath, pressure mounted on Dahl to recant his story. Under questioning from the FBI, he eventually claimed the entire thing had been a hoax, a story he and Chrisman had concocted to sell to a magazine. The case was labeled as such, and Air Force officer Edward Ruppelt, who later led Project Blue Book, called it the dirtiest hoax in UFO history. But that label never sat well with everyone. Declassified FBI files from the investigation, sealed for 50 years, revealed something curious. Agent Jack Wilcox, who worked the case directly, concluded in his reports that Dahl's hoax confession itself appeared to be fabricated, that Dahl had been pressured into recanting by forces that wanted the story buried. And in 2017, the Washington State Senate passed a resolution formally acknowledging the cultural and historical significance of the Maury Island incident, a strange gesture for something that was supposed to be nothing more than a lie. Whether the Maury Island incident was a genuine UFO encounter or an elaborate fabrication, one detail remained stubbornly consistent across every retelling: the man in the dark suit who appeared at Harold Dahl's door the morning after, the one who knew things he shouldn't have known, who drove a car that didn't belong in that neighborhood, and who delivered a warning so specific and so chilling that Dahl was afraid to speak about it for years afterward. That stranger was the first man in black, and he would not be the last. 6 years later, and roughly 3,000 miles to the east, in the industrial city of Bridgeport, Connecticut, a man named Albert K. Bender was about to learn that same lesson in a far more terrifying way. Bender was not a pilot or a harbor patrolman. He was a factory worker with a passion for the unexplained. And in 1952, he had founded what he called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, one of the first civilian organizations dedicated to investigating UFO reports. He ran the operation out of the attic of his family's home, a cramped, cluttered space he had decorated with horror movie posters, skulls, and occult paraphernalia that earned it the nickname the Chamber of Horrors. From that attic, Bender published a small newsletter called Space Review, which circulated among a growing network of flying saucer enthusiasts across the country. For a brief period, the IFSB was one of the most active civilian UFO groups in the United States, and Bender was its tireless center of gravity, collecting reports, corresponding with witnesses, and pushing for the government to disclose what it knew about unidentified aerial phenomena. Then, in March of 1953, everything stopped. Without warning, Bender shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He ceased publication of Space Review. He withdrew from every contact, every correspondence, every investigation. The man who had been one of the most vocal advocates for UFO transparency in the country went completely silent, and when friends and colleagues pressed him for an explanation, all he would say was that he had been visited and that he had been warned. It would take nearly a decade before Bender finally told the full story. In 1962, he published a book titled Flying Saucers and the Three Men, and what he described in its pages remains one of the most bizarre and unsettling accounts in the history of the Men in Black phenomenon. According to Bender, he had been sitting alone in his attic one evening when a wave of nausea and dizziness suddenly overcame him. The room filled with a thick, yellowish fog that carried with it the sharp, unmistakable stench of sulfur. And then, standing before him, were three figures. They were dressed identically in dark suits and dark Homburg-style hats, the kind that clergymen might wear. Their faces were shadowed, their expressions blank, and their eyes, Bender would later say, glowed like flashlight bulbs. They didn't appear to have walked up the stairs or entered through the door. They were simply there, as if they had materialized from the fog itself. Bender also noticed that they seemed to hover slightly, their feet not quite touching the floor, drifting a few inches above the surface, as though gravity was something they were choosing to ignore. And then they spoke, but not out loud. The words arrived directly inside Bender's mind, clear and cold and unmistakable. Stop publishing. Stop investigating. You are getting too close. If you value your safety, you will abandon this work immediately. Bender was paralyzed. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, the three figures faded, dissolving back into the yellow fog until they were gone, and the attic was empty again, save for the lingering stench of sulfur and the pounding of Bender's heart. He never published another issue of Space Review. He never attended another meeting. The man who had devoted years of his life to uncovering the truth about unidentified flying objects retreated into total silence, and he stayed that way for almost 10 years. When he finally told his story, many dismissed it as fantasy or delusion. But a fellow UFO researcher named Gray Barker took Bender's account seriously enough to write his own book about it in 1956, titled "They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers." Barker's book was the first to describe the men in black as a recurring phenomenon, not a one-time event, but a pattern of intimidation that seemed to follow anyone who got too close to something they weren't supposed to see. And Barker was right. While Bender had been fighting his own private terror in Bridgeport, other people in other parts of the country were having encounters that were strikingly similar, encounters that suggested whoever or whatever the men in black were, they had been busy. In November of 1961, a man named Paul Miller was hunting with 3 companions near Minot, North Dakota, on a cold, clear evening when they saw something that stopped them in their tracks. A luminous object, shaped like a silo, descended from the sky and landed in a nearby field. The light it gave off was intense, but strangely diffused, as though it was glowing from within, rather than projecting beams outward. As Miller and his companions stared, 2 humanoid figures emerged from the craft, moving in a way that Miller later described as both deliberate and unnatural, like they were walking through water. The figures approached the group, and Miller, an Air Force employee who was no stranger to unusual sights in the sky, reacted on instinct. He raised his rifle and fired. One of the figures appeared to stumble, as though the shot had connected, and then both retreated back into the object, which rose into the air and vanished with stunning speed. What happened next is where Miller's account takes on the quality of a nightmare. He and his companions experienced what can only be described as a blackout. One moment they were standing in the field, staring at the sky where the object had been. The next, roughly 3 hours had passed, and none of them could account for the missing time. They drove home in silence, shaken and confused, and made a pact not to speak of what had happened. But the next morning, when Miller arrived at his office on the Air Force Base, 3 men were already waiting for him. They were dressed in dark suits and carried themselves with the rigid, practiced calm of people accustomed to being obeyed. They claimed to be government officials, but showed no credentials, no badges, and no identification of any kind. And yet they knew everything. They described the events of the previous night in exact detail. The shape of the object, the behavior of the figures, the shot Miller had fired, the blackout that followed. They asked questions, but not in the way that investigators typically do. It wasn't as though they were trying to learn what had happened. It was as though they already knew and were simply confirming it, testing whether Miller would tell the truth or try to hide it. Their manner was detached, clinical, almost robotic, and when the interview was over, they delivered the familiar warning. Say nothing. Tell no one. Forget what happened. Miller was so shaken by the encounter that he did exactly as they asked, remaining silent about the experience for years. 6 years after Paul Miller's encounter in the frozen fields of North Dakota, a man named Robert Richardson was driving along a quiet road in Toledo, Ohio, one evening in 1967, when something happened that he couldn't explain. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated an object sitting in the middle of the road. He didn't have time to stop. His car struck the object, and in the instant of impact, the thing simply vanished, as though it had been a projection or a hologram rather than something solid. Richardson pulled over, rattled and confused, and when he got out to examine the road, he found a small piece of metal lying on the asphalt near where the object had been. It was unusual, heavier than it looked, with a strange, smooth finish that didn't resemble any alloy he was familiar with. He picked it up, put it in his pocket, and drove home. 3 days later, at around 11 o'clock at night, 2 men appeared at Richardson's door. They were young, dressed in black suits, and they arrived in a black 1953 Cadillac, a car that even in 1967 would have looked conspicuously outdated. They didn't identify themselves. They asked Richardson about the night of the collision, questions that were oddly specific, as though they had been briefed on every detail. Then they left, offering no explanation for who they were or how they had found him. But a week later, 2 different men appeared. These were also dressed in dark suits, but they looked different from the first pair. Their skin was darker, their features vaguely foreign in a way Richardson couldn't place. One of them spoke English with a precision that seemed rehearsed, every syllable perfectly formed, as though the language was something he had studied rather than grown up speaking. The other had an accent that Richardson couldn't identify, something that didn't match any nationality he'd ever heard. These men were more direct. They wanted the metal fragment. Richardson told them, truthfully, that he had sent it to a laboratory for analysis. And that was when the temperature in the room seemed to drop. One of the men looked at him and said, in a voice that was perfectly calm and all the more frightening for it, that if Richardson wanted his wife to stay as pretty as she was, he'd better get that metal back. Then they turned and walked out into the night. Richardson was disturbed, not only by the threat itself, but by the impossibility of how they knew about the metal in the first place. He had told only a handful of people about the fragment, and none of them knew these men. When he later attempted to trace the Cadillac's license plate, he discovered it was registered to a car that didn't exist, a phantom vehicle tied to an address that turned up nothing. The metal fragment, meanwhile, was analyzed and found to have an unusual composition. But before any definitive conclusions could be drawn, it vanished from the laboratory. No one could explain how. While Robert Richardson was dealing with his visitors in Toledo, something far stranger was unfolding about 500 miles to the east, in the small town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Between November of 1966 and December of 1967, the town experienced 13 months of what researchers would later call high strangeness, a concentrated burst of unexplained phenomena that included UFO sightings, bizarre phone calls, encounters with a winged creature that locals called the Mothman, and repeated visits from men in black. The man who documented much of this activity was a journalist and paranormal investigator named John Keel. Keel was a serious researcher with a sharp, skeptical mind, and he spent months in Point Pleasant interviewing witnesses, tracking sightings, and piecing together a picture of what was happening to the town. He was, in fact, the person who coined the term Men in Black and who introduced the now famous abbreviation MIB into the popular lexicon. And what he found in Point Pleasant was deeply disturbing. Residents reported being visited by men in dark suits who arrived in black Cadillacs, who asked strange questions about the Mothman sightings and UFO activity, and who seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of the witnesses' private lives. One woman told Keel that a man in black had appeared at her door and recounted details of a conversation she'd had with her husband that morning, a conversation that had taken place inside their home with the curtains drawn and no one else present. Another witness described being followed by a black car that would appear behind them on rural roads, maintain a steady distance for miles, and then simply vanish, as though it had turned onto a road that didn't exist. Keel noticed something odd about the pattern. Early in his investigation, When he published details about the men in black driving Cadillacs, the reports of Cadillac sightings suddenly stopped. After that, the men in black were seen in different vehicles entirely, as though they had read Keel's reports and adapted. He also documented what he called phantom photographers, men who appeared at witnesses' homes and took photographs using cameras that produced blindingly bright flashes, far brighter than any commercial flash unit of the era. The men would take their photos and flee before anyone could stop them. Keel chased several of these phantom photographers, and on more than one occasion he enlisted local police to help, but the men always vanished before anyone could catch up to them. Then, on December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge, a suspension bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Gallipolis, Ohio, collapsed during rush hour, plunging 46 people into the icy waters of the Ohio River. It was one of the worst bridge disasters in American history. Keel, who had been documenting the escalating strangeness in the town for over a year, believed the timing was connected to the phenomena, that whatever had been visiting Point Pleasant had been building towards something catastrophic. After the bridge collapse, the sightings of the Mothman and the men in black in Point Pleasant stopped almost entirely, as though a switch had been flipped. Keel wrote about his experiences in his 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, in which he proposed that the men in black were not government agents at all, but something far stranger, entities he called ultra-terrestrials, beings that existed in a dimension adjacent to our own and who occasionally crossed over to interact with humanity for reasons we couldn't fully comprehend. It was a theory that sounded like science fiction, but for the people of Point Pleasant, who had lived through those 13 months, who had opened their doors to strangers who knew things they shouldn't have known and who disappeared as quickly as they appeared, the theory didn't seem quite as far-fetched as it might have from the outside. Nearly a decade after the strangeness in Point Pleasant subsided, and in a quiet, rural stretch of Maine, a respected physician named Dr. Herbert Hopkins had an encounter that remains, to this day, one of the most chilling and detailed accounts of a man in black visitation ever recorded. It was the evening of September 11th, 1976. Hopkins was home alone, his wife and children out for the evening, and he had been working as a consulting hypnotist on a UFO abduction case involving a man named David Stevens. Stevens claimed to have been taken aboard an unknown craft and subjected to a medical examination by non-human entities, and Hopkins had been using regression hypnosis to help him recover fragmented memories of the event. It was sensitive work, and Hopkins had been careful about who he discussed it with. The phone rang. On the other end was a man who identified himself as the vice president of the New Jersey UFO Research Organization. He spoke in a flat, measured tone and asked if he could come by to discuss the Stevens case. Hopkins, who was accustomed to receiving inquiries from UFO researchers, agreed, but what happened next defied any normal explanation. Hopkins hung up the phone, walked to his back door to turn on the porch light, and the man was already there, walking up the steps. The drive from the nearest town was at least 15 to 20 minutes. The man could not have been calling from anywhere nearby and arrived that quickly. It was as though he had been standing outside the entire time, waiting for permission to enter. Hopkins opened the door, and what he saw made the blood drain from his face. The man was completely bald, not shaved bald, but naturally hairless, lacking eyebrows, eyelashes, and any trace of facial hair whatsoever. His skin was a dead, waxy white, smooth and uniform, like the skin of a plastic doll. His lips were a vivid, unnatural red, and Hopkins realized with a start that the man was wearing lipstick, a thick coat of bright red lipstick applied over what appeared to be a perfectly straight slit where a mouth should have been. There were no actual lips beneath the color, just a line. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, a black tie, a crisp white shirt, and gray suede gloves. His black hat sat squarely on his head, and everything about his clothing looked brand new, as though it had been purchased that afternoon, or as though it had never been worn before. The man entered the house and sat down. His movements were stiff and deliberate, and his voice, when he spoke, was a flat, mechanical monotone, like a voice synthesized by a machine rather than produced by a human throat. He asked Hopkins about the Stevens case, and Hopkins, still in a kind of stunned compliance, answered his questions. But as the conversation progressed, the man did something that Hopkins would never forget. He asked Hopkins to take a coin from his pocket and hold it in his palm. Hopkins did so, producing a shiny new penny. As he held it out, the coin began to change. It turned a silvery color first, then took on a bluish tint. And then, right there in Hopkins' open hand, the coin became blurry, indistinct, as though it was going out of focus. And then it was gone. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't been snatched away. It had simply dematerialized. The man looked at Hopkins and said, in that same flat tone, "Neither you nor anyone else on this planet will ever see that coin again." Then he added something that sent a chill down Hopkins' spine. He referenced Barney Hill, one half of the famous Betty and Barney Hill abduction case, the most well-known alleged alien abduction story in the world. Barney had died of a cerebral hemorrhage in 1969, and the visitor made a remark connecting the disappearance of the coin to the death of a man who had also seen too much. The implication was clear and unmistakable. Then the man told Hopkins to destroy all of his research on the Stevens case. Every tape, every transcript, every note. Hopkins, in a state of deep unease that bordered on paralysis, agreed. And then something happened that elevated the encounter from unsettling to genuinely terrifying. The man's speech began to slow. His words stretched and dragged, like a recording being played at decreasing speed. "My energy is running low," he said. "Must go now. Goodbye." He stood, staggering slightly, and made his way to the door, gripping the railing with both hands as though his body was failing him. Hopkins watched from the window as the man walked down the steps and into the yard, where a bright bluish-white light was visible in the driveway. The man moved toward the light and then was gone. There was no car, no engine sound, just the light, and then darkness. Hopkins did exactly as he was told. He destroyed every tape, every file, every scrap of research related to the Stevens case. He erased recordings, shredded notes, and burned transcripts, methodically dismantling months of careful work as though it had never existed. When his wife and children returned home that evening, they found Hopkins sitting in the living room, pale and barely able to speak. His family dog, which had been in the house during the entire encounter, was found hiding in the back of a closet, trembling violently, and it refused to come out for the rest of the night. The family cat, on the other hand, hadn't moved at all from its spot on the couch, as though it had been entirely unaffected, or perhaps simply unable to perceive whatever had been in the room. In the days that followed, Hopkins noticed strange marks on his porch railing where the visitor had gripped it on his way out, smooth indentations pressed into the wood, as though by something considerably stronger than a human hand. Those marks, unlike the visitor who left them, did not disappear. Hopkins was deeply shaken, and he remained so for the rest of his life. He told the story many times over the years to researchers, journalists, and fellow investigators, and he never wavered in the details. It should be noted that years later, in 2008, Hopkins' nephew posted on a blog that the entire encounter had been fabricated, that his uncle had invented the story for attention. This claim has been debated in the UFO research community ever since, with many pointing out that Hopkins was a well-respected physician with no history of attention-seeking behavior, and that his account remained remarkably consistent over more than 30 years of retelling. Whether one believes the nephew's assertion or Hopkins' own testimony, the encounter remains one of the most frequently cited and thoroughly detailed men in black cases in the historical record. While some encounters with the men in black seemed rooted in the paranormal, in visitors who defied the laws of physics and biology, at least one case demonstrated beyond any doubt that the United States government was entirely capable of conducting exactly the kind of intimidation and disinformation campaign that the men in black were famous for. And this case didn't involve mysterious strangers in Homburg hats or coins that vanished into thin air. It involved a physicist, an Air Force base, and a conspiracy that was deliberately engineered to destroy a man's mind. Paul Bennewitz was, by all accounts, a brilliant and accomplished man. He held a master's degree in physics, and in 1969 he had founded a company called Thunder Scientific Corporation, which manufactured specialized temperature and humidity testing instruments for high-profile clients, including NASA and the United States Air Force. His laboratory and his home were both located in Albuquerque, New Mexico, directly adjacent to Kirtland Air Force Base, which meant that the military was quite literally his next-door neighbor. For years, the arrangement was mutually beneficial. Bennewitz sold equipment to the Air Force, and the proximity made doing business convenient. But in 1979, Bennewitz began noticing something he couldn't explain. Late at night, standing in his backyard, he could see strange lights appearing in the sky above Kirtland, drifting and darting in patterns that didn't match any known aircraft. At times, they streaked away with impossible speed, only to reappear seconds later, apparently miles from where they had just been. Other nights, the lights hovered in place for long stretches, pulsing with a steady rhythm, as if they were signaling something or someone on the ground below. The lights were appearing over and around the Manzano nuclear weapons storage facility, which at the time was the largest underground repository of nuclear weapons components in the Western world, honeycombed with tunnels and shafts crammed with warheads and replacement parts for atomic devices. The fact that these lights were dancing above one of the most sensitive nuclear installations in the country made Bennewitz's observations feel all the more urgent. He also detected unusual electronic signals on his monitoring equipment, transmissions that seemed to originate from somewhere on or near the base, but that didn't correspond to any standard military communication frequency. As an electronics expert, Bennewitz had the skills and the equipment to investigate, and he threw himself into the project with the kind of focused intensity that had made him successful in business. He filmed the lights, he recorded the signals, he compiled detailed reports and charts and analysis, all of which pointed, in his mind, to one conclusion. Something was operating in the airspace above Kirtland Air Force Base that was not of human origin. That same year, Bennewitz attended a public meeting about cattle mutilations held in Albuquerque, where he met a highway patrol officer named Gabe Valdez, who had been investigating a series of bizarre animal deaths in the northern part of the state. The meeting further fueled Bennewitz's conviction that extraterrestrial activity was occurring in New Mexico, and he began reaching out to anyone who would listen, writing to newspapers, television stations, senators, and even the president. For the most part, his correspondence was ignored. But the Air Force did not ignore him. In fact, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, known as AFOSI, took a very keen interest in Paul Bennewitz. But not for the reasons he would have hoped. The lights Bennewitz had been filming and the signals he had been recording were almost certainly related to classified military projects being tested at Kirtland, possibly early stealth aircraft, or advanced electronic warfare systems. Bennewitz had stumbled onto something real, but it was not aliens. It was a secret so sensitive that the Air Force couldn't simply tell him the truth without compromising national security. And so, instead of quietly discouraging him or simply ignoring his reports, AFOSI made a decision that would define the rest of Paul Bennewitz's life. They decided to play along, and then some. An AFOSI agent named Richard Doty was assigned to Bennewitz. Doty's job was not to shut Bennewitz down, but to redirect him, to take his genuine observations and wrap them in a layer of fabricated extraterrestrial mythology so thick that no one would ever take him seriously. Doty met with Bennewitz repeatedly, validating his suspicions about alien activity while feeding him carefully crafted disinformation. He provided Bennewitz with forged documents, including papers describing a fictitious government program called Project Aquarius that supposedly dealt with recovered alien technology. He told Bennewitz about an underground alien base in Dulce, New Mexico, a sprawling facility where aliens and humans supposedly collaborated on genetic experiments. None of it was true. All of it was designed to push Bennewitz further from reality, and AFOSI didn't stop there. They recruited a prominent UFO researcher named William Moore, the co-author of the first major book on the Roswell incident, to serve as an additional channel for disinformation. Moore's role was to befriend Bennewitz, earn his trust, and then funnel even more fabricated material into his research while simultaneously reporting back to AFOSI on Bennewitz's mental state and activities. Moore would later admit to this arrangement publicly in a speech at the Mutual UFO Network's 1989 annual convention in Las Vegas, where he confessed that he had participated in a deliberate effort to push Bennewitz toward a mental breakdown. The audience was stunned. Moore was ostracized from the UFO research community almost overnight. But by the time Moore made his confession, the damage was done. Over the course of nearly a decade, the disinformation campaign had consumed Paul Bennewitz entirely. He became convinced that aliens were entering his home at night and injecting him with drugs while he slept. He began sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. He lost weight dramatically, smoked incessantly, and abandoned basic personal hygiene. His relationships deteriorated. His business suffered. By August of 1988, he had accused his own wife of being controlled by extraterrestrials. He was eventually hospitalized for a severe nervous breakdown. Paul Bennewitz never fully recovered. He died on June 23, 2003, a man who had been brilliant, successful, and curious about the world, and who had been systematically and deliberately broken by the very government he had been trying to help. The cruelest irony of all is that the fictional narratives fed to Bennewitz by AFOSI agents, the stories about Project Aquarius, about the Dulce base, about alien government conspiracies, didn't die with his credibility. They seeped into the broader UFO community and became foundational elements of conspiracy lore, stories that are still repeated today by people who have no idea they originated as a calculated government operation designed to destroy one man's sanity. The Bennewitz case is important for a reason that goes beyond its own tragedy. It proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the United States government has been willing to use intimidation, manipulation, and disinformation to silence individuals who stumble too close to classified information. And it raises an uncomfortable question about every other Men in Black encounter in the historical record. How many of those mysterious visitors were not otherworldly beings, but flesh and blood agents carrying out precisely the kind of operation that Afosi ran against Bennewitz? The answer, unfortunately, is that we may never know. But what happened next in a small town in Virginia suggests that the line between government intimidation and something far more sinister may be thinner than anyone wants to admit. In October of 1987, Danny Gordon was sitting behind a microphone at Wytheville, a small country music radio station in Wytheville, Virginia. Gordon was a radio journalist, the kind of local news voice that everybody in a small town recognizes. And on that particular day, a report came across his desk from the Wythe County Sheriff's Department. 3 sheriff's deputies, all of them former military men, had witnessed an unidentified flying object the previous night. Gordon, a self-described skeptic, treated the story as a light-hearted piece, something funny to end his newscast with. He had no idea that it was about to upend his life. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The phone lines at Wytheville lit up. Listeners began calling in with their own sightings, their own stories, their own encounters with strange objects in the sky above Wythe County. Within weeks, Gordon had received over 1,500 reports. He set up a dedicated call-in program, expecting the wave to crest and recede, but it only intensified. Determined to find a rational explanation, whether it was military aircraft or atmospheric phenomena, Gordon began investigating in earnest. One night in October, Gordon and a friend named Roger Hall drove out into the countryside, armed with cameras, hoping to photograph whatever people were seeing. What they witnessed was beyond anything Gordon had prepared for. They observed a domed craft with a strobing light hovering silently in the sky. As they watched, a smaller red object appeared, rose toward the larger craft, and appeared to merge with it, as though a smaller vessel was entering a larger one. They were so stunned that they failed to photograph the objects on the first night, but they returned the following evening and managed to capture images, though the developed photos showed only vague streaks of light, as frustratingly ambiguous as most UFO photographs tend to be. Gordon scheduled a press conference to share his findings. The night before it was set to take place, his phone rang. The caller refused to identify himself, but spoke with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. He told Gordon that the CIA and the federal government were very much interested in what was happening in Wythe County, and that it was not Gordon's place to be messing in defense matters. The caller urged him to leave it alone. Gordon held the press conference anyway, but the warning had shaken him. The sightings continued through the winter and into 1988. Gordon kept reporting, kept investigating, and the calls kept coming, both from excited witnesses and from anonymous voices telling him to stop. Then, on March 19th, 1988, another anonymous call came in. This one from a man who claimed to be a retired military intelligence officer. This caller was more specific. He told Gordon that the government didn't appreciate his research and that they had ways of dealing with people who didn't listen. He made a reference to Gordon's children that made Gordon's blood go cold, suggesting that harm could come to them, and mentioned something about chemical warfare. The implication was unmistakable. Stop, or your family will suffer. Not long after that call, Gordon's son was shot at a party under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Witnesses initially reported that the shooters were 2 men dressed in black, though those witnesses later changed their statements under circumstances that remain unclear. Gordon's son survived, but lost his eyesight. Whether the shooting was connected to the anonymous threats or was a tragic coincidence has never been established. But for Danny Gordon, it was enough. He stopped investigating the UFO sightings. He stopped reporting on them. And perhaps most eerily, the sightings themselves seemed to stop for him as well. After 1990, Gordon never saw another unidentified object in the sky above Wytheville. The case was later featured on the television program Unsolved Mysteries, and Gordon, who recently retired from Wyve, has spoken about the experience in the years since. He has never fully explained what happened in Wythe County, and the anonymous callers who threatened him were never identified. Around the same time that the threats in Wytheville were intensifying, two men showed up at Wyve claiming to be reporters for a national magazine. They interviewed Gordon at length about the sightings and his investigation, but when Gordon later tried to verify their credentials, the magazine had no record of them. No article was ever published. The men, whoever they were, had come to gather information under false pretenses and then disappeared without a trace, leaving behind yet another thread that led nowhere. About 14 years after the events in Wytheville, on a street in New York City in 2002, the phenomenon reached someone whose name most people would recognize instantly. Dan Aykroyd, the actor and comedian best known for Ghostbusters and the Blues Brothers, had been filming a television series called Out There for the Sci-Fi Channel. The show was a serious, documentary-style exploration of UFO sightings and paranormal phenomena, and Aykroyd, a lifelong enthusiast of the unexplained, had completed 8 episodes and was in the process of filming additional material when something happened that he says he has never been able to explain. During a break in filming near 42nd Street in Manhattan, Aykroyd stepped outside for a cigarette and received a phone call. As he stood on the sidewalk, he noticed a black Ford sedan parked across the street. Leaning against the car was a tall man in a black suit. The man was staring directly at Aykroyd with what the actor later described as a look of absolute hostility, a penetrating glare that felt less like curiosity and more like a warning. Aykroyd looked away for what he described as less than a second, a momentary glance to adjust his phone or check the ground. When he looked back up, the car and the man were gone, completely gone. The street was a one-way road, and there was no way a car could have pulled away, turned, and disappeared from sight in that fraction of a second without Aykroyd hearing the engine or seeing it pass by. The car and its occupant had simply vanished, as though they had been erased from the scene. 2 hours later, Aykroyd was informed that Out There had been canceled immediately, mid-production. He was told to stop filming at once. No satisfactory explanation was ever given. The official reason cited was creative differences, with the network claiming they wanted a more comedic approach, while Aykroyd had been producing a serious investigative program. But Aykroyd has never accepted that explanation. He has said publicly on multiple occasions that he believes the cancellation was connected to the man in black he saw on 42nd Street, particularly given that the next episodes he had planned included interviews with prominent disclosure advocates. All 8 completed episodes of Out There remain locked in a studio vault. They have never been released. The most recent encounter on our list takes us to Niagara Falls, and it is unique among men in black cases for one remarkable reason. It was caught on camera. In October of 2008, Shane Sover, the manager of the Sheraton Fallsview Hotel in Niagara Falls, New York, and a security guard working the night shift, both witnessed a large triangular object hovering silently in the sky outside the hotel. The sighting was reported to local UFO investigators, and an investigation team visited the hotel to examine the evidence and interview the witnesses. A few weeks after the investigation, hotel staff reported something unsettling. Two men had entered the hotel and asked to speak with Sovar and the security guard by name. Neither man was present at the time, and the visitors left without providing identification or contact information. What made the encounter noteworthy was the way the staff described them. The two men were tall, identically dressed in dark suits and fedora-style hats, and they looked almost exactly alike. Their skin was extremely pale, almost white, and their faces lacked any trace of eyebrows or eyelashes. Their eyes were described as abnormally large, and they moved in perfect synchronization, as though they were a single organism operating two separate bodies. Multiple members of the hotel staff reported feeling deeply uneasy in their presence, with one employee saying that the men seemed to know what people were thinking before they said it. The hotel's security cameras captured footage of the two men entering the lobby. The video shows two tall figures in dark clothing moving through the space with an eerie, synchronized gait. Their faces, though partially obscured, are pale and expressionless. But here is the detail that has troubled investigators ever since. The security cameras recorded the two men entering the hotel, but no footage exists of them leaving. They simply do not appear on any exit camera at any point after their arrival. The footage was released publicly in 2012, and it remains the only known video evidence of an alleged Men in Black encounter. There are skeptics, of course, and they raise legitimate questions. The footage was released 4 years after the incident and close to the theatrical release of a popular science fiction film about the Men in Black, which some have suggested was a deliberate marketing connection. Sovar himself later became affiliated with a UFO investigation team, which some have pointed to as evidence of a potential motive for fabrication. But analysis of the hotel's interior in the footage, particularly the carpet patterns and lobby furnishings, has been dated to before a renovation that took place in early 2011, which is consistent with the footage having been recorded in 2008 as claimed. Whether the video is authentic remains a matter of ongoing debate, but if it is, it represents something unprecedented. Visual evidence of the kind of visitor that witnesses have been describing in remarkably consistent detail for nearly 8 decades. So where does all of this leave us? After almost 80 years of encounters, after dozens of witnesses from all walks of life, from harbor patrolmen and factory workers to physicians and Hollywood actors, the Men in Black remain as mysterious as ever. The physical descriptions are remarkably consistent across time and geography. The waxy skin, the missing eyebrows, the mechanical voices, the impossibly detailed knowledge of private events. The black cars that appear from nowhere and vanish into nothing. The threats, the confiscated evidence, the lingering sense that something deeply wrong has just passed through your life and left no trace behind except a feeling you can't shake. Some researchers believe the Men in Black are exactly what the Bennewitz case proved at least some of them to be: government agents, flesh and blood operatives from agencies like the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, the CIA, or the NSA, tasked with keeping the lid on classified programs by intimidating anyone who gets too close. There is documented evidence to support this theory, and it would be naive to dismiss it entirely. Others, like John Keel, believed the Men in Black were something else altogether: interdimensional beings, entities he called ultra-terrestrials, who exist alongside us but are normally invisible, and who manifest in ways that mirror our expectations of authority and menace. And still others have proposed a middle ground, that some men in black are real government agents operating under real orders, while others are something we don't yet have a framework to understand, something that borrows the language of authority, the dark suit, and the official manner, the way a predator might mimic the coloring of something harmless. What is certain is that the witnesses who have come forward over the years, many of them at great personal cost, have described something that doesn't fit neatly into any single explanation. The men who visited Harold Dahl knew things they shouldn't have known before anyone had reported the events. The figures who appeared to Albert Bender floated above the floor and communicated without opening their mouths. The stranger who sat across from Dr. Herbert Hopkins made a coin dissolve in the palm of a hand and then slowed down like a machine running out of power. The agents who dismantled Paul Bennewitz's life were all too human in their methods, but monstrous in their effects. Danny Gordon's anonymous callers knew details about his family that should have been private, and the threats they made were followed by violence no one has been able to explain. And the figures captured on camera at the Sheraton Fallsview Hotel entered a building and were never recorded leaving it. The pattern persists. The suits are always black. The skin is always wrong. The knowledge is always impossible. And the message, delivered in a voice that never quite sounds like it belongs to a living person, is always the same. Stop looking. Stop talking. Forget what you saw. But people don't forget. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't fade the way the men in black seem to. It stays with you. It settles into the walls of your house and the back of your mind like a stain you can't scrub out. And on quiet nights, when the phone rings and you don't recognize the number, or when you glance out the window and see a dark car idling at the curb with a driver who seems to be watching just a little too closely, you find yourself wondering. You think about Harold Dahl in that diner booth, his breakfast getting cold in front of him, while a stranger described things that only he should have known. You think about Albert Bender alone in his attic, watching 3 figures materialize from yellow fog. You think about a coin vanishing from a doctor's open palm. You think about a man's voice slowing down like a dying engine, and a bright light in the driveway where no car should have been, and a knock at the door that comes at the hour when nothing good ever knocks. Are they watching? Have they always been watching? And what happens if you answer the door? Thank you for listening tonight. If you enjoyed this, I would really appreciate it if you would hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below letting me know which of tonight's stories unsettled you the most. Sweet dreams.